Welcome to Et al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to Et al., a podcast at Baylor University Press. I'm Joshua Mobley, joining you here from the Evangelical Theological Society, and I'm joined today by Sean McDonough. Sean McDonough is the Mary French Rockefeller Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. His newest book, which is very excitingly titled Truth's Consuming Ecstasy, Literary and Philosophical Investigations of the Apocalypse of John, is out now with Baylor University Press. And I will say, I would have had a physical copy here with me to show everyone, but we have sold all of them.
That's good news.
We sold out here at ETS. So I don't even have a physical one to show everyone, but I'm sure we can edit in a photo and post so that everyone can see the cover. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, good to be here.
I know we're in Boston, so not too far from where you live and work.
Yep, my hometown and where I was born and raised, and just down the street from where I teach.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I've really enjoyed Boston so far. I've not really done Boston properly before, so it's been really nice so far.
Oh, it's a lovely town and manageable, not the size of New York or LA or something like that.
Yes,
so.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it so far. Okay, so let's start with the title, Truth's Consuming Ecstasy. So what is so consumingly ecstatic about truth? Talk to us about the title.
So the title is from W.B. Yeats's poem, To Ireland in the Coming Times. After choosing it, I realized it sounded like a mashup of a anti-drug PSA and a Harlequin romance, but I like the title nonetheless. And in fact, I do explain at the very end of the book, so you need to purchase it and read the entirety of it to see precisely what's going on there. But suffice it to say,
so those who persevere to the end will be saved.
Exactly. But suffice it to say that it does, in its own poetic way, via Yeats, capture the heart of the book, which is that the unique subject matter of Revelation, namely heaven realities and realities of the ultimate future, are best captured not in prosaic explanations, but by a kind of imaginative venture into an ecstatic realm where things exceed your ability to control them linguistically or otherwise. And so there is something that's just beyond our ability to speak about in the ordinary ways and means of everyday communication.
Yeah, and that's really what you're drilling down on in this book, are the ways that the book of Revelation, it's trying to express things that exceed our grasp, right? But you approach the book of Revelation in particular in a rather unique way. So you do an overview and you engage with a good deal of biblical studies scholarship on the text as well. But you're primarily interacting with three pairs of conversation partners. So Plato and Wittgenstein, Yeats and Tolkien, and Bulgakov and von Balthasar. Now, each of these, you argue, help us understand Revelation in some way. But why have you taken this approach? You've sort of gathered this group of conversation partners for a pint, as it were, to talk about the book of Revelation. What is revealing about doing it in this conversation and dialogical way?
So I think the fact that Revelation communicates through images and not just through explanation augurs for understanding it in a way that goes beyond just kind of a rational reflection and thinking more imaginatively about the book. And so by going a little obliquely after the topic, I think we're kind of mirroring Revelation's own indirect strategy of communication. And I've teach Revelation pretty much every spring for the last 25 years.
Okay.
Greek exegesis of Revelation. And as I tried to capture a little bit about how Revelation communicates, not just the bare content. If you kind of boil everything away, then it's talking about staying faithful to Jesus and keeping his commands and living in hope and all the other things that are everywhere in the New Testament. Why is it the way it is? That's the key question. And I've found that I start every class with film clips, particularly from kind of a little more esoteric or avant-garde films, Hayao Miyazaki's anime, or Quentin Tarantino, or Maboroshi, a Japanese film. And it's to try to show the students that imaginative communication is a valid way of knowing about the world and speaking about it, which is precisely what revelation itself is doing.
Yeah.
And so this book is a kind of academically inclined version of that indirect way of approaching things. Now, I will say Plato and Wittgenstein are included because Revelation actually has far more philosophical depth than it's often given credit for. And then Yeats and Tolkien reflect the imaginative way that Revelation goes about his business. And Balthasar and Bulgakov really do both spend quite a bit of time with the text itself, which is of great interest, but their whole kind of theological modus operandi is very imaginative and apocalyptic in its own way. And Cyril O'Regan and Notre Dame, he's described them as apocalyptic theologians, and I think the designation's quite apt.
Yeah. Yeah. And so one way of reading Revelation is as a kind of coded text because of a persecuted context or something like that. And so they're trying to speak sort of sotto voce about things that they couldn't say out loud, and you don't deny that that's the case, but you are suggesting that the form of the text is much deeper than that.
Right. And it's kind of the case, but it's funny, right? Because we can sit here at 2,000 years removed and figure out that it's talking about the Roman emperor. So you have to kind of assume that first century people who were on the scene and would figure out that a city with 7 hills probably wasn't Lisbon, though I'm given to understand it has 7 hills, but Rome. So if it's meant to be coded communication, it's not a particularly difficult to code to break in certain critical respects, right?
Right.
I mean, plenty of it remains opaque, but the critique of the Roman emperor and the Roman Empire and its idolatry is one of the clearest things there is. The thing which you would be most inclined to hide if that were the purpose. And so my argument is that it's cryptically delivered because it's speaking about things that exceed our ability to comprehend and linguistically control.
Right. So let's dive into that question of comprehension and linguistic control. We'll start with Plato. So the name Plato and the word myth are viewed with suspicion in some theological quarters that prefer to avoid both of those terms. So what does Patmos have to do with Athens? What is it about Platonic myth that illuminates the book of Revelation?
So the basic association of Plato and Revelation, which Bulgakov himself makes, or at least Plato and myth in general, and Revelation being pretty demonstrably a species of mythical communication in a way that will define it. But Plato and John, I like to say, back into each other. So Plato, throughout his works, uses any number of stories, which he sometimes overtly describes as mythoi, myths. Sometimes they're evidently that genre. He doesn't use the term, but he uses those all the time. And John, as I've indicated, does have considerable philosophical depth, particularly concerning being and seeming, or reality and illusion. And he uses the verb to be in a very pointed way throughout his epistle. And Revelation is an epistle to the 7 churches there. So there are these funny commonalities we wouldn't necessarily expect between the two. Now, when I use the word myth, sometimes I start by putting in quotation marks, because I don't love it either, but I can't find a better word to describe image-filled dramatic stories which seek to comprehend the whole of reality, and yet in an indirect way, not in some kind of scientific description. And Plato himself is ambivalent about myth. So he'll essentially often say, well, I'm going to tell you a story now, and I'm kind of embarrassed to do it, and it's really not the right thing to do, but here I'm going to tell you a story about souls going up to heaven or being dragged into Tartarus, or a soul in a chariot ascending up to heaven and seeing the eternal ideals of justice and truth and beauty and all the rest of it. He demurs, he doesn't want to do it, and yet he does it all the time.
Yes.
And so it's an interesting question I explore in some depth.
Yeah, I've taught the Republic for many years at Baylor to undergraduates. And it's, you spend the whole time complaining about Homer and complaining about the myths and what they do. And then suddenly the whole thing closes with the myth of and he's going to give you a new myth at the end. And so whatever he's doing there, it isn't a straightforward rejection of the poetic tradition, the mythological tradition.
It's ambivalent at best. And maybe it's accommodating slower learners, right? There are any number of things scholars wonder about as to why he did it. And there is no question that, as I've said, he's at best ambivalent. Yet at another level, we got to ask, why does the greatest philosopher of antiquity, and maybe the greatest philosopher ever, continually resort to those modes of communication? That maybe there's more there than even he suspected.
Right. So talk to me about that distinction between appearance and reality that's at play throughout the book, and how does the mythological form of the book help communicate that?
Okay, so in the epistles to the individual churches, or the messages to the churches in chapters 2 and 3, which is the only part of the book a lot of people ever hear preached or taught, so most people know that reasonably well. He'll say things like, I know you are poor, but you are rich. So materially you're poor, or externally you're poor, but in fact, in reality, because you are adhering to my ways, you are rich. And so there's this subtle but noticeable distinction between what is the case and what seems to be the case. Laodicea, by contrast, appears to be rich, but they are in fact pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. And that takes on a kind of cosmic dimension of duplicity when we get to the visionary material, particularly in chapters 12 to 14, where we have the satanic trinity, the dragon, the beast, and the second beast, who are obvious counterfeits of the Holy Trinity. And so there's this cosmic duplicity, this cosmic deception, which is underwriting the everyday ways we fool ourselves about our wealth or our status or whatever it is that we appear to be, which can shroud the reality of who we actually are. And so God is introduced in the beginning as the one who is and was and is to come. In the later chapters, the beast is described as the one who is not. And I think that is reflective of a fundamental ontological deficit that evil, we'd say, possesses, but it's precisely the lack of genuine being that's the problem of evil. And so Revelation, in its own image-filled, quote-unquote, mythical way, anticipates the more refined theology of evil as parasitical on the good, or evil as a deprivation of the good. But it does it in a lot more interesting, vivid sort of a way, with this cosmic drama and these grand deceptions underwriting the little deceptions that we engage in all the time.
So there's a really interesting parallel there between the deceptions of evil and the riddle of the text itself. So talk to us about, you use that term riddle and you're deploying it in relation to Wittgenstein and his philosophy. And so my question is, how is the text of Revelation a riddle? But more importantly, why does it have to be? Like, why does it have to be communicated in this puzzling, sort of riddling sort of way? So what is a riddle in Wittgensteinian terms, and how does Revelation do that, and why?
So, and the language of riddling comes from two of Wittgenstein's legatees, if that's the word I'm looking for, the Cora Diamond and Stephen Mulhall. Cora Diamond has written a lot of technical assessment of Wittgenstein's philosophy, along with her sometimes collaborator, James Conant, who was my freshman year science teacher in college. But that's just
fantastic.
A fun fact. And then Stephen Mulhall has a book, the Great Riddle, speaking about the fact that anything exists at all, and various other big picture things. So I get the language from them. But Wittgenstein is certainly a riddling kind of philosopher. And the example I always use with my students is, he says at one point, if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand it, which is just one of these Zen moments where you think, well, I feel like there's something profound there, but I really need to puzzle out what it is. And precisely because people fall for illusion and lose reality, you need a penetrating spiritual vision to see the way things really are. So Rome will present itself as a beneficent, ordering, loving overseer of people's lives. John sees it as a ravenous beast. And so the strange image helps shock you into a recognition of what Rome really is. So our senses and our sense-making are so habituated to living in the illusion. We need something to radically shake up our way of thinking about things. We don't need to just put more information into our pre-existing operating system, to use a software analogy. We need a complete shift of the way we perceive them. And riddles, as Mulhall in particular points out, open up new conceptual spaces in which things that we couldn't quite grasp before become clear. And there's perhaps two reasons riddles are important as well. Is the fact we mistake illusion for reality, but there's equally the fact that God himself is an infinitely puzzling being to finite creatures.
Right.
So our sin shrouds him from us, but also our limitations mean that there's always, and Bart is really good on this, any revelation of God is simultaneously a concealing and a revealing, that he is revealing who he is, the God who lives in freedom. But our temptation to just grab hold of him and think we've got our grubby little hands right round his absolute essence is a deception. And so communicating his infinite glory, his plans for the world in a puzzling fashion is the appropriate way for us as limited creatures to gain understanding of him, but an understanding which is tempered by humility and a recognition of the limitations of those understandings. So there's a penetration through deception. There's an appreciation of divine infinite inscrutability. And there's also what Wittgenstein would call work on ourself, where getting away from our habituated patterns of thought liberates us to see the truth of God in the way that we can comprehend it.
Yeah. Now, you do sort of stake a claim to a particular way of reading Wittgenstein as well, kind of pushing back against one way, which would say that the limits of language really are the limits of the knowable. And you're suggesting that Wittgenstein is open to a much broader reading than that, perhaps. Could you say a few words for the Wittgenstein nerds out there who want to know your position on these things?
So one of the critical subtle things I have in the book is there's a quotation from, I think it's from Sturge Moore, who's the brother of the Cambridge philosophical colleague of Wittgenstein, to Yeats, of all people, saying, I agree with Wittgenstein, whom I don't understand. So I find myself in precisely the same position as Moore, which is that I like to say Wittgenstein's philosophical therapy has been effective in my life, but I don't want to claim to understand him, particularly because he really is giving us philosophical exercises to help us think about things in a different way. He's not proclaiming doctrines to be asserted. Now, that in itself is a view of Wittgenstein, but I think it's my personal testimony, so to speak.
Sure.
But in terms of the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, which is his first work, that is a source of great debate among Wittgensteinians, and I go with Cora Diamond and James Conant, who believe that when Wittgenstein says these things I'm saying are really nonsense, that he means that. That's known as the austere reading of the Tractatus. That there is a presumption of absolute understanding which we need to get rid of as we embark on the philosophical way. We don't try to solve all sorts of problems all at once. We just take the problems as they come and try to do our best to think clearly about them. So my view of Wittgenstein is that of Diamond and Conant. So
okay, great. Very good. Well, I think all of the Wittgenstein nerds out there are now appeased that they know where you stand on these issues. Okay, so moving on to Tolkien. Your section on Tolkien is really marvelous and really illuminating in a lot of ways. I've read Tolkien. I've not read about Tolkien, so it's all just kind of my experience of his writing. But you really opened some fabulous interpretive doors. And you say at one point that truths are not told, but rather show themselves in relation to Tolkien's general distaste for allegory, this sort of one-to-one allegorical storytelling. And so I'm wondering, how is that a good description of apocalyptic writing more broadly? And how does that help us read the ambiguous and difficult text of Revelation?
And the interesting thing there is Tolkien arcs very close to Wittgenstein. And the phrase that you cite there about things showing themselves is in fact from Conant in particular, his interpretation of Wittgenstein, which is ethical truths, for example, or the most important things in life can't just be explained, but they kind of show themselves. And I use the example, again, to the extent I understand Wittgenstein, something like humor. So I use the example where Wittgenstein in real life used to love going to the movies, and he watched all these American gangster films. And so when he was speaking with one of his students and they went to go check out a place. He said, we're going to go case the joint. And and I just find it hilarious, as apparently do you as well. So what's the joke, right? We could explain the joke and why it's an ironic juxtaposition of a philosophical genius and an American film gangster. But if you explain the joke, there's no joke remaining.
Right.
It emerges in the experience of hearing it. Or Wittgenstein himself uses the illustration of a face. He likes to use pictures. You draw a little face and you say, well, what's that expression? And we're tempted to ask, well, where's the expression? As if we could locate it physically. Right. But the experience of seeing someone who's disillusioned or upset or whatever is different than just the sketch. It can't be reduced to what we can control. And so Tolkien, who does say about The Lord of the Rings that it's a profoundly Christian book, right, and that it's about God and his sole right to divine honor, that is clearly not something he's saying in the book. Right. But it's somehow being shown by the actions of the characters, and in fact, it works, right? There's plenty of people have their lives profoundly altered by it. I said in class the other day, I've learned more from Gandalf as a fictional creature about how to be a better human than most living humans. Yeah. Right. Now, of course, that's Tolkien's own wisdom kind of manifesting itself through him, but you get caught up in the world of the story. And this is another way of thinking about Revelation, that just as in The Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins leaves his kind of bourgeois English enclave. I mean, it's not literally England, but it might as well be. Right. And then he encounters dragons and wizards and dwarves and all these kind of things. That has the pattern of what in romantic literature is known as the Bildungsreise, which is the kind of journey of self-development, to use a modern sort of phraseology, that you go into the land of wonders so that you have a refreshed vision for your life in the everyday. And that is precisely what John's doing. He takes us on a visionary journey into heaven and hell and the future and the past and everything else, so that we have a different perspective on the life we live day by day, and the life is people were living in Asia Minor day by day. Right.
Yeah, so the transformative process then of reading the text is one in which these truths are meant to emerge, but also in some sense to hit us at a slant, right? And work their way into our imagination of the world, but maybe without following a rigorously syllogistic logic or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. There's almost something very kind of Dante about that as well.
I mean, Dante, we could have done a whole book just on Dante as an apocalyptist, but I'm sure many of those have already been done.
Sure, so, yeah. Okay, so staying with Tolkien then, one of the things that emerges throughout his writing is this really poignant psychology of evil that you get both with Morgoth and with Sauron, perhaps Sauron as well. How does that play out? Talk us through your reading of those things.
So if this is for the hardcore Tolkien nerds, that if you embrace the Silmarillion as well as the Lord of the Rings, you have a very interesting kind of hierarchy of evil and its manifestations. So Morgoth is originally one of these angelic figures who participate in the creation of the world. In fact, he's the most gifted one of them, but he's got this inexplicable self-will that is his ultimate undoing. And so he ends up as a pure nihilist who just wants to destroy. And that's echoed in the inexplicable counter-creation drive of the dragon in the book of Revelation. Yeah. There's no explaining why someone would want to undo the good created order. There's no explaining why someone would want to ascend to the throne of the only true God, but the dragon just does. And then he is appointing someone as a world ruler, which is very much like Sauron, who is Morgoth's lieutenant or lieutenant for our British friend. Sauron is not consumed with the same nihilism. He just wants to control everything according to Tolkien. Right. And so Tolkien's not writing allegory, but when you think of the fascist regimes of the mid-20th century, it's a pretty good match for the sort of thing Sauron is trying to do, which is get things his way, manage them in a way that will please him, even if it means stepping on all sorts of both human and natural world things. And Saruman is kind of a pale imitation Sauron. And then Gollum is the sort of outworking of evil at the individual level, which could, in its own imaginative way, reflect the choices before John's own people.
Right.
They're not going to dominate the world, but they can make these petty choices for evil, which in fact will begin to consume them and cause them to lose the connection with the living God, which is the only way you can have actual being.
Right.
So I like to say it's like an ontological rupture, and your being bleeds out as you adopt the way of deception.
Yeah.
Which ultimately leads to nihilistic opposition to God.
Right.
You know.
Right. Let's turn here at the end to Bulgakov and Balthazar. I will say your chapter on Bulgakov was remarkably clear. And I have read a fair amount of Bulgakov, and I think I agree with a lot of it. I can't say that I understand it. So, I'm with readers of Wittgenstein here on Bulgakov. But talk us through this figure of Sophia and how that relates to this whole conversation.
Sophia, or divine wisdom, is Bulgakov's way of thinking about and speaking about the big picture relationship of God and the world. If we wanted to get into detail, he's essentially working with a Platonist model where in the Timaeus, Plato's account of the creation of the world, you've got this entity, the eternal living creature, which is kind of like the sum total of the ideas for things in the world, a kind of divine plan or blueprint. But of course, for Plato, that's going to be superior to what's realized in the real world. But
yes,
suffice it to say that the plan for the unfolding universe is called the eternal living creature, but then that has to be imbued into matter to realize the vision. And that is called the world soul. So essentially, Bulgakov will speak of the divine Sophia, which, for all his demurrals about not fully committing to Platonism, it's very much like the eternal living creature,
sure.
Except significant difference is the personal God of the Christian tradition is the one these ideas belong to. So it's God's vision for the world. And then the creaturely Sophia is the divine realization of that plan or those ideas in the world, where Bulgakov's really good and where Western theologians really need to heed him is he does want to talk about the liveliness of the world and the fact that God upholds that and authorizes that and imbues the world with his life. Does he go too far to the point where some people will say he's positing a fourth person in the Trinity, which of course that would be one too many. And he says, no, I don't want to do that.
Right.
But people, it feels like Sophia as divine life does represent a fourth person, or at a minimum, a kind of divine energy coursing through the cosmos. And that's the tricky thing of what Sophia is. But on the positive side, Bulgakov's appreciation for the beauty of the world, which reflects God's beauty, Bulgakov's appreciation for the liveliness of things, and that is a participation in the divine life, that is just really good. I think if I had to adopt maybe a bit of a halfway point here, Andrew Davison has a wonderful book on participation.
Yeah.
And precisely because the word participation doesn't purport to tell you everything you want to know, but is sort of a black box or a repository, that I find that the most helpful way to describe the relation of God and the world, that it's a creaturely participation in the divine life. And that allows sufficient ambiguity that some of the mechanics Bulgakov introduces with Sophia to say precisely how it is that God infuses the world with his life, infuses the world with his beauty. It feels a little too much for me.
Sure.
But when we get to the end of the book of Revelation and God's glory, which is represented in the text of Revelation as jasper-like glory. So in chapter 4, the word jasper is used once to describe the radiance from the divine throne. That then becomes the characteristic atmosphere of the New Jerusalem, is defined by this jasper-like glory.
Yeah.
And so some sense that God's presence, which has always been upholding things in some sense, but now it particularly suffuses the creation, we can't lose that. And Revelation is the place where that truth, which Bulgakov will want to call a sophiological, is a great word, sophiological realization.
Yeah.
Something is true there. And we again, particularly in a kind of industrial and now even more in this information age, we do suck the divine life out of the world and treat it as mere object to our peril and our inability to understand lots of parts of the scripture.
Yeah, and as I was reading that chapter and reflecting on it, the sense that that I came away with was that what makes the revelation of actual events that are happening in time, what makes those things theologically load-bearing, is that this is still a kind of divine drama. That because this is the reflection of the divine in beauty, which is perhaps being marred by evil. This is the reflection of God in humans who are made in the image of God, which is being corrupted by that same evil. All those things suddenly become theologically load-bearing because creation is shot through with the divine presence in some way, even if we can't precisely say how, right? Is that an accurate reading of what you're saying here?
Yep.
Yeah. And which leads into then the question about Balthazar and drama. Okay, so your reading of Balthazar here is bringing in his notion of drama as a helpful way of understanding what's happening in Revelation. So in what way is this a drama, and what does that mean? Presumably that doesn't just mean this is all fake and staged.
So the minimal claim, which is easy to appreciate, is the scripture unfolds in a narrative fashion. So what Balthazar is going to do on the one hand is really put that at the center of his theological reflection. And I think that's genius because we're so habituated again to thinking of God in purely abstract terms, timeless terms.
Yes.
And the story of the world become just sort of illustrations for children who don't get the explanations and the abstractions.
Right.
And Balthazar's fundamental point is God, you don't understand him. You don't know what's happening unless you're carried along in this divine drama. Now, he then goes into taking that as a strong metaphorical complex to think about God as the author and the director and we're the actors. And I think it's quite fruitful. But even if you think he maybe exhausts that after a while, the basic sense of narrative theology or whatever we want to call it is surely biblical. And furthermore, it helps us make sense of our lives. So with my students, I always point out that throughout the New Testament, the Exodus, and this is the dominant motif in Revelation as well, the Exodus idea of a movement from, in the big picture, sin and death through the wilderness of the world to the promised land, helps you make sense of the ambiguities and ups and downs of life. It helps you make sense of people who can seemingly believe and then walk away from that.
Right.
Much better than the purely abstracted, timeless theology. They're saying, well, if you said a prayer or something happened or you were one of the chosen, then just automatically that's the way it is. And you have to kind of just think about it this way. But seeing life as a journey is much more helpful. The other area I think it's immensely important to see things as a drama is, I don't want to use the word theodicy, which suggests we can just timelessly say, well, everything bad that's happening is fine because X, Y, and Z. No, it will be fine because the unfolding action of God in the world. And so the healing of the blind man in John 9 is the parade example of this. And Irenaeus' comments in Against Heresies 5 are the best piece of biblical theology ever written, in my opinion, where he points out that this fellow on the road is not finished in a sense. And Jesus, rather than looking to the past, well, who did this, who sinned that this guy should be in this situation, he's looking at the eschatological fulfillment when God finishes the work. And so the divine action in time is the only way to fully reckon with the tragedy of life as it is.
You might add Julian of Norwich to your account there of, the great act that the Trinity will do at the end of time, which will allow these things to make some kind of sense, but you don't have any real access to that today. I think that one of the things that your book has accomplished, and that I think is quite remarkable, is that you've taken this text, which is rather strange, and you have let it be strange. And you have not tried to strip it of its strangeness, but have maybe given us some conceptual categories for helping engage it in its own weird kind of world and to let it stay weird. And I think that's really important. Could you say a few things about that in closing here?
Yeah, and the most important image I try to inculcate in people when I'm saying, well, how do you work with Revelation, is it's like wandering in the North American wilderness. And I use the North American wilderness because it's kind of lush and there's a lot going on. Biblical wilderness is so arid and dry and, haunted by demons and whatever. But the North American wilderness is beautiful and rich and crazy. But it's not under your control. A bear could come at any point. You don't know where this path might lead. You don't know when a storm will come. But it's precisely that experience of being thrown into something that's greater than yourself and out of your control that is the blessing, that you don't want to take away the wildness. I say somewhere that Revelation is kind of the wilderness in contrast to the urban control of a systematized theology, which is fine in its place.
Sure.
Right. But Revelation needs to be kept wild and not under control. We don't want to make it a strip mall or a city. We want to let it be what it is. And so you can learn to function in the wilderness more effectively, and you better if you're going to survive it.
Right.
And if you've got guides who have been around there, they can help you accommodate it. But controlling it is to take away the very point of the venture into the wilderness.
Yeah.
So that's what I would leave people with, is let it be wild.
Yes. Yeah. Well, by all means, read the book of Revelation and read Sean McDonough's latest book, Truth's Consuming Ecstasy, out with Baylor University Press right now. Pick it up at baylorpress.com. Sean, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.